All right. Good morning to our speakers and distinguished guests from the government, the academe, civil society, and think tanks. I am Joyce Ilas. I am the Communications and Advocacy Lead of Strat-based ADR Institute and also a co-convener of Democracy Watch Philippines. And I will also be your host for this morning. On behalf of the Strat-based ADR Institute and Democracy Watch Philippines, I welcome you all to our online post-SONA assessment forum for this morning, entitled Rhetoric versus Action, Reviewing the Alignment of Promises and Implementation under the Marcos Jr. presidency. Now, this event will bring together key figures in various sectors who will provide their assessments on President Bongbong Marcos Jr.'s second State of the Nation address, and also their insights on a recent anti-corruption survey, which will be released by Pulse Asia this morning. More specifically, we will also look into the economic, governance, social, and foreign policy perspectives on the current and potential policy directions of the Marcos Jr. administration and the steps forward coming into the second year. To formally open our event today, let us all welcome Strat-based ADR Institute's President, Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manhit.
Good morning to stakeholders, participants, our speakers, our moderators, members of the Philippine public in today's gathering as we look into the post-SONA. We've heard the President speak. We have heard and listened even cabinet secretaries during the Philippine economic briefing. As I welcome everyone, I would like to state my views and focus on what I call, can they sustain the gains of the first year? Can we look at the second year governance, the initiatives of the President Bongbong Marcos administration, and look deeper into it, actual programs, actual initiatives. But before I go into that, I'd like to share what we track regularly in Strat-based. We always, through the years since 2004, identify what we call risk and opportunities, not only at the local level, but even at the geopolitical level. We can speak of social issues, even the digital divide, or even the need for investment-led growth. Climate crisis. Just 2 weeks back, we spoke of asymmetric security challenges during our July 12 Arbitral Award International Fund. But I would say at the core of all this is the issue of corruption and bad governance, which we consider as key deterrent to generating investments in creation of the enabling business environment and sustaining economic recovery that generates jobs and livelihood for the Filipino people. 2 weeks back, I saw the announcement of the government, and they spoke of Bagong Pilipinas under Memorandum Circular number 24. The campaign calls for deep and fundamental transformations in all sectors of society and government, fosters a state's commitment under the leadership of our head of state, President Bongbong Marcos Jr., towards the attainment of comprehensive policy reforms and full economic reform. Nice initiative, nice logo, Bagong Pilipinas. I've always said in my classes when I used to teach governance, development management, or public administration at the De La Salle University, you have to look from statements to actual policies. And are there actual policies? And are actual policies funded? I'm happy to hear about the priority expenditures for 2024, because this is key. They speak of shovel-ready infrastructure projects, investments in human capital, the education and health sector, sustaining agriculture growth, and ensuring food security, even emphasizing climate change adaptation and mitigation, which is part of the 8-point program. At the core of all this, I go back, is governance. Are there enough governance initiative that we can institutionalize in the second year of the Bongbong Marcos Jr. administration? And I take note of key structural reforms being initiated by the Department of Budget and Management. We've heard them speak of progressive budgeting for better and modernized governance. And I take note of it. It's a legislative initiative. This will institutionalize things if it turns into a law. Even the national government right-sizing program. We need to maximize the resources of government, human resources, and the power of technology. We need to find digital transformation as a key part of governance. Also, the Green Public Procurement Program. Strong initiative, very strategic, that needs the full support of everyone, whole of society, under this Bagong Pilipinas initiative. It reminds me of what I've always said. No matter if we see good things, good ratings, there's still room for improvement. Foremost among this is the fact that our consumer-driven economy is vulnerable to external shocks and disruption. COVID-19 taught us that. And we, as StratBase, have always pushed for one that is driven by investment in terms of growth, because it creates jobs, income, infrastructure, and improved quality of life. This might take years. This cannot happen overnight. The government must ensure that it establishes and maintains the right environment to attract investors and actively collaborate with the private sector, both domestic and foreign. Simple desires that we hear from them: transparency, accountability, and responsiveness. Stable policy environment. We cannot eradicate corruption, but we should attempt to control corruption. The State of the Nation address is always a much anticipated day. The President tells us a roadmap for the coming year. Issues that he would like to address. So what Mr. Marcos said and might not will tell us many things about what we could realistically expect for the next 5 years and beyond. We will be watching, we will be listening beyond the SONA, and as we look into the second year of the Marcos administration, Jr. administration. Again, good morning, welcome to our participants in this virtual roundtable discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Dindo Manhit. If we recall, just last Monday in his State of the Nation address, the president very briefly discussed or mentioned corruption in his speech. He said that he pushed for digitalization of government services, which he said that is a powerful tool against graft and corruption. He also, in his discussion of the administration's war on drugs, the president also said that he will install, quote, individuals with unquestionable integrity, and that he cannot tolerate corruption and incompetence in government. Now, what do you think our people think, the Filipino people think about corruption? So we will now move on to our next speaker, who will discuss or who will present the results of the latest Pulse Asia survey on corruption. So ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome the president of Pulse Asia Research Incorporated, Dr. Ronald Holmes. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Joyce. Good morning to all of those who are listening. And thank you to StratBase again. I hope that the slides are seen. The slide is seen. So just to proceed, again, I thank StratBase for the invitation to participate in today's forum. As Joyce mentioned in the last State of the Nation address of the President, he briefly mentioned something about corruption. I actually look into statements that came even before, and one of the statements that he did come up with in earlier period is shown in this particular slide. Moment, just a technical difficulty. Okay. Apologies for that one. I hope you're seeing the slide, Joyce. Is it okay?
Yes, sir. We can see the slide. You may proceed.
Okay, let me proceed again. So I searched through some of the prior statements of the president, and one statement came during the campaign. Right after the campaign. And this was in response to a question as to what he would do vis-a-vis the main revenue generation agency. As you can see in the statement, he basically acknowledged that corruption is endemic, and that this is a deep-seated problem. But one of the things that I basically wish to emphasize here, is that he gives more focus or emphasis probably to the attention to addressing the corrosive influence of corruption rather than the cause of corruption. This to me is indicative of not necessarily that corruption might not necessarily be a priority of the administration. As mentioned by Joyce, in the past two SONAs, actually, the president has mentioned the need for digitalization. Prior presidents have also mentioned this, but digitalization is just one of the measures, administrative measures, and it may not necessarily be the most important measure, because what we need to understand is that the causes of corruption, basically corruption is rooted in a structure or a system. As Johnson notes, the Philippines is within what is referred to as an oligarch and Clark syndrome. You have the dominance and competition among clans and oligarchs amidst weak institutions. They compete, and it would be difficult to prevent corruption. Johnston, for example, mentions that what normally happens is that anti-corruption efforts in an oligarch and clan society are essentially smoke screens for continued abuse or ways to put key competitors behind bars. We've seen this in the past. As one of my colleagues would say, if you talk about oligarchs and opposing oligarchs, basically in each administration, you have their own cronies, and former cronies would be considered as oligarchs. Given the band-aid and half-hearted or mere administrative versus structural reforms instituted in the past, what we've seen in surveys is that corruption remains an urgent concern for the public. In the June survey, for example, the top 4 issues are gut issues, but what we've seen not only in the June survey, but even in previous surveys, is that the primary governance issue always has been fighting graft and corruption in governance. It was an urgent concern. I remember immediately after he assumed the position in 2010, it was almost at the same level as controlling inflation. I referred to the early administration of the late President Noynoy Aquino, probably because he anchored or rooted his campaign in fighting corruption. People felt that it is really an urgent issue that must be attended to. But across all administrations, from our surveys in 1999 to the present, fighting graft and corruption is one of the top 5 concerns. In certain instances, it is even the second or even the topmost concern, tied with controlling inflation. Of the 16 issues listed here, we see that fighting graft and corruption is ranked 5th most urgent. It's the first governance concern that I mentioned that the public believes should be attended by the national administration. In the same survey, we asked Filipinos to assess the performance of the national administration in resolving most of these concerns. We had 13 concerns listed. in the performance rating of the national administration. One can see that the top 5 concerns, which are creating more, controlling inflation, increasing the pay of worker, creating more jobs, reducing the poverty of many Filipinos, and fighting graft and corruption. These are concerns where the administration's ratings happen to be the lowest relative to the other concerns that their performance was rated. With regard to fighting graft and corruption, there is no significant change in terms of approval from the March to the June survey. And we see here that the approval rating of the administration is less than a majority. One of the 3 concerns where the administration did not generate majority approval, which is an indication that people are, a plurality might be satisfied with the way the administration addressed the issue. Almost an equal number are ambivalent about the administration's performance, and about 2 out of 10 Filipinos are not happy about the administration's performance in fighting graft and corruption. If we try to recall what has happened in the past year, we've had allegations of policemen being involved in illegal drugs. Actually, this led the administration to call for the courtesy resignation of about 900 PNP officials. Most recently, the resignation of 18 of these officials were accepted by the president. What is not clear was whether the president accepted their resignation from their posts or whether the president accepted the resignation from the Philippine National Police. But even then, people are saying, why is it that they are allowed to resign? Why is it that they are not in any way? Why is it that cases are not being filed against them if they were really involved in protection of illegal drug syndicates? Maybe this is one of the reasons why you have a public that is disapproving, at least 2 out of 10. In addition to these questions, we also fielded in the June survey questions that were commissioned by StatBase. There were 3 questions. The first probe elicited from Filipinos their view on whether the agencies, laws, and mechanisms to fight corruption should be strengthened. The result shows a significant majority agreeing to the need to strengthen anti-corruption institutions. You find it here. 84% agree with this statement. The sentiment is divided between strongly agree and somewhat agree. This national sentiment is reflected more or less at the same level in NCR and the balance of Luzon, and it's much more higher in Mindanao. Also, you have a marginally higher agreement among those in the ABC and almost the same level of agreement in classes D and E. Virtually no one disagrees with the strengthening of the agencies, laws, and mechanisms to fight corruption. If we apply the margin of error of plus or minus or -3 in this survey, then the disagreement here would be zilch, none. So this is what we saw in the first survey. If I may add, beyond this survey, one of the usual recommendations in the past, based on studies of effective anti-corruption mechanisms and processes abroad, it is important that government consider at this point establishing a single, well-resourced anti-corruption agency that has fiscal autonomy and is insulated from partisanship and political interference. Unfortunately, this recommendation, which has been given to past administration, has not been heeded. Perhaps this administration would take on and eventually follow through and adhere to and implement this particular recommendation. The second question asked Filipinos what they thought was the primary benefit of controlling corruption. As it is seen in this slide, a plurality note that addressing predation, leakages, embezzlement, and political corruption, among many other forms of corruption, will aid in the recovery and development of the economy. This is a primary benefit cited across all areas and socioeconomic groups, although in the Visayas, an additional benefit cited by the plurality will be improving the plight of ordinary citizens, which is the second most important benefit that can be derived from controlling corruption as identified by Filipinos. The others would be in terms of improving areas of governance from law enforcement, achieving the ideal of good governance, delivering public services, the effective utilization of government resources, and the improvement of democracy. Those were the choices given to them, but the primary benefit, as mentioned, is that it will aid in terms of economic development and recovery. On the final question, majority of Filipinos felt that corruption erodes their trust in government and public officials. A bit more disturbing, though not surprising, and many times mentioned as one reason why corruption persists, almost a majority of Filipinos express a sentiment that they have been desensitized to corruption, that they find that their attitude towards corruption has been more or less normalized. It's a sense of helplessness, probably, but this is a problem, as I mentioned. It is disturbing because if people already submit that corruption is pervasive and nothing can be done, then that will be the end of what we refer to or what we wish would be democratic deepening in the country. The other effects of corruption that people felt affect their condition more would be inefficient service delivery, the abuse and intimidation by members of government, and the reduction of public funds that are devoted to poverty, healthcare, and employment. These findings lead us to hope that perhaps if Filipinos truly feel the ill effects of corruption, that there will be a constituency to fight corruption that will snowball and be sustained in as much as our nation's development depends on substantively controlling corruption. In the end, I would like to, at this point, I would like to simply quote Pope Francis when he said in 2014 that corruption is paid by the poor. Maraming salamat po.
All right. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Dr. Ronald Holmes. Again, 84% believe that there is a need to strengthen the fight against corruption. More specifically, strengthen the power of national agencies, laws, and mechanisms. As Dr. Ronnie Holmes said, it is important to point out really how when we hear about corruption issues, especially in the executive, often we hear people resigning, leaving their posts, but not really getting prosecuted, going through the process. Also very interesting also how 67% of Filipinos said that they lost their trust in, or they are losing their trust in government. But more interesting, what Dr. Ronnie pointed out also is that more than half, or about half of Filipinos have a normalized attitude towards corrupt practices. So we do have a lot to unpack there later. And I'm sure many of our participants right now have questions in mind. So to those who wish to participate in the open forum later, you may write your questions in the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen. So, and then we'll get to that later. But for now, let us move on to our next sector and our next speaker, who will provide his assessment on the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Marcos Jr. administration's national security strategy. He is a professor at the De La Salle University Manila's International Studies Department and also a trustee and program convener at the Strat-based ADR Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Renato De Castro. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Can
Yes,
you hear
sir.
me? Okay, so I have a PowerPoint presentation. So, okay, my presentation is actually based on a number of papers that I have written trying to map out Philippine strategy in terms of an emerging China. So my presentation today, I'll try to be quick about this, is the Marcos administration evolving foreign policy from what we call looking at the picture of balance to what we considered as a hard balancing policy, in a way that it is why the Marcos administration shifted from efforts to find what we call the holy grail of finding an equilibrium between the United States and China to a point directly challenging China in a way no different from what was adopted by the late President Benigno Aquino III from 2010 to 2016. So let me just start my presentation. Okay. So at the onset of his term, of course, President Marcos implied, this was, of course, in his first State of the Nation address, he wants a balanced foreign policy, captured by the rhetoric of friends to all, enemies to none. So his approach is to find the midpoint on how we could find, of course, a quid pro quo between the United States and China, who are, of course, currently engaged in a strategic competition. So the purpose is to promote cooperation with both the United States and China, in a way enabling Manila to gain practical benefits from both Washington and Beijing. Okay, something's wrong with my power. Okay, so in his first State of the Nation address, he implied that he gave impression that he wants close cooperation with China, but at the same time, of course, balance by a security by a revived security relations with the United States. In employing a balanced foreign policy, President Marcos envisioned a division of labor, where, of course, Washington is a close treaty ally, captured by what he said when he first met Secretary Antony Blinken. You know, I cannot imagine a future with the United States for the Philippines. And of course, he repeated that statement when he met President Joe Biden in September last year. So at the same time, of course, he thinks that Beijing is a significant source of public investment in infrastructure, Philippine infrastructure development, a market for Philippine export, and of course, a major destination for Chinese tourists. President Marcos probably learned from what the former President Duterte did experience in dealing with China. Despite efforts to enhance foster economic cooperation with China, and in a way appease China, this will not moderate Chinese behavior in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, specifically, of course, towards the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Coast Guard, and more significantly, to ordinary Filipino fisher folks. So at the onset of his term last year, he allowed the Armed Forces of the Philippines to have closer discussions with their American counterparts, which of course happened in September in Hawaii. So defense analysts, of course, describe President Marcos' foreign policy as an effort to find the middle point between the late President Benigno Aquino III policy of directly challenging China and, of course, the appeasement policy of former President Duterte when he mentioned this, the sedimentation of the approaches of his predecessor, more flexible and less principled than the late President Aquino III, but less charitable and, of course, generous to Beijing in terms of course, appeasing China. So this, of course, this begs the question on how the Marcos administration could tread this delicate balancing act. Of course, this requires the Philippines to walk a fine line between fostering greater security cooperation with the United States, but of course, at the same time, maintaining China's goodwill necessary to keep the Chinese market open to Philippine export and Chinese public investment to keep flowing to the Philippines to fund, of course, his major infrastructure project. Of course, the main challenge here is whether China and the United States would allow the Philippines to find the middle ground, given the fact that both great powers are engaged in a great power competition. Whether they allow the Philippines to find the middle ground, or the term used, enmesh or equibalancing, pitting each other, each other against each other, with the hope that this would provide the Philippines greater diplomatic room to maneuver. Of course, more specifically, the challenge here is regarding China's attitude. Because at this point in time, China wants to maintain what President Xi Jinping said to former President Rodrigo Duterte when he visited China just a week ago, when he mentioned this: I hope you will continue to play an important role in the friendly cooperation between China and the Philippines. Let's understand the context of what President Xi Jinping said, a friendly cooperation between China and the Philippines. Of course, as we know, given what happened in the last 6 years, but for China, for the Philippines to earn China's friendship and goodwill, the Philippines has to adopt an appeasement policy, which of course, President Rodrigo Duterte purposely did in his 6 years in office. He distanced the Philippines from its long-standing treaty ally, and of course, tried to gravitate towards China, a great power, of course, that has a territorial dispute with the Philippines and is, of course, bent on effecting a major territorial revision not only in the South China Sea, but also as far in the East China Sea in terms with its relationship with Japan. So President Duterte managed the West Philippine Sea dispute, of course, primarily according to Chinese terms, bilateral negotiations setting aside the July 12, 2016 arbitral ruling, and of course, trying to prevent any party from becoming involved in this dispute. Of course, the Philippines at this point in time is a crossroad regarding whether it will be worthwhile for President Marcos Jr. to continue his predecessor policy of balance, continuing the appeasement policy, gravitating to an attempt to find the balance. But of course, at the end of the day, this of course ended up with adopting a policy of directly challenging China. Okay, so my presentation would examine the events that led, in fact, to the unraveling of the rhetoric of friends to all, enemies to none, at least in terms of rhetoric, and of course, in an effort to find the balance between China, but ended up between China and the United States, but ended up, of course, in directly challenging China or adopting what we call a hard balancing policy towards, of course, Beijing. So, and of course, at this point in time, why is it the fact that this current administration has moved away from its rhetoric of a balanced policy and instead has adopted a hard balancing policy towards China. So let's look at the early period of trying to ponder and let's explore what do you mean by a balanced foreign policy. So President Ferdinand Marcos, at the onset of his term, of course, would like to implement a balanced foreign policy between the US and China, marked, of course, by efforts to promote economic cooperation with China. This was, of course, captured when he first met, now he's back in his office, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, when he met him in Beijing just a few weeks after his inauguration. He said China is the most important partner in terms of the economy, but at the same time, of course, when he met Secretary Antony Blinken in September, I think it was August, when he said, I cannot imagine a future for the Philippines without its relationship with the United States. So again, going back to this very resourceful and insightful young Filipino defense analyst, this strategy potentially makes the Philippines the holder of the balance in the region. Again, we go back to how his father played the game during the Cold War, when you have two major American bases here, and how he used it to basically enable the Philippines to leverage on its strategic location, of course, here in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, this is a given. The Philippines is the only Southeast Asian country that could host significant American forward deployed forces that, of course, threaten not only China, but of course, China's effort to expand into the first island chain. Manila could, of course, use this advantage to extract leverage, economic concession from China, and of course, hopefully, moderate Chinese expansive behavior and coercive behavior in the South China Sea. Unfortunately, of course, three developments thwarted the Marcos administration efforts to hold or find the balance. I'll just have to breeze through this. Number one, of course, a large proportion of the Filipino military, the Filipino society and the Philippine military in particular simply do not trust China. And of course, you have the surveys conducted by Pulse Asia that has always been consistent. China is the least trusted country among the Filipinos. China has a negative trust rating among the Filipino public. And of course, this is a key challenge, China's mismanagement of the South China Sea dispute. China's goal is basically to effect both a de facto and de jure control of the South China Sea. And this, of course, means impressing upon other claimant states that China owns the waters in the in what it calls the 9-dash line. And of course, during the early period of the Marcos administration, you have two major incidents that happen. Of course, you have Coast Guard ship blocking and arresting a small Philippine Navy supply ship on its way to resupply a small Philippine Armed Forces garrison on Ayungin Shoal, and of course, swarming of fishing boats manned by suspected Chinese militia. Then, of course, you have the intensification of US-China strategic rivalry, which provided opportunities for the Marcos administration to really leverage on its alliance with the United States and security partnership with other US allies, like, for example, Japan, South Korea, and of course, Australia. Okay, let's just proceed. So what basically led to this, shift from the rhetoric of a balanced foreign policy to the actual policy of a hard balancing policy towards China? So what are the number one? Of course, President Marcos has decided to continue the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines. This is an indication that despite this effort to balance China, there's still suspicion on the part of the Philippine government whether China would, of course, be the Philippines and China could find the modus vivendi on how they could manage their dispute in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. So as an insurance, as a leverage. Of course, we go back to the Duterte administration. Although the Duterte administration adopted a policy of appeasement, it, of course, continued the modernization program of the armed forces of the Philippines. President Bongbong Marcos is no different. In fact, he provided more funds to the modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines. And all his statements, every time he had a major event in any camp of the armed forces of the Philippines, he always emphasized the need to shift to an external defense and the need for the armed forces of the Philippines to understand geopolitics and international relations. Just have to breeze. And of course, the key point, the revitalization of the Philippine-US alliance. So just have to breeze through what had happened. Of course, the key points was the decision to expand EDCA by the designation of 4 additional AFP bases for US forces to operate in those agreed sites. Expansion. What would be the implication here? Of course, the implication here, it will create the condition for the armed forces of the Philippines to rely more on the United States for its force modernization program. It will also, of course, boost U.S. capacity to operate across the first island chain, especially, of course, in the middle country of the first island chain, which is, of course, no less than Taiwan. Of course, given a possible conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. Then, of course, this have to do, of course, with the EDCA and the possibility of a combined maritime operation between the United States Navy and the Philippine Navy, possibly plus along with the inclusion of the Japanese and even the Australian Royal Navy. A large-scale Balikatan exercise, which we can discuss later. Then, of course, the new bilateral defense guideline, which provided greater clarity on under what condition can the mutual defense treaty be invoked. Okay, so, and of course, the other component of this hard balancing policy is fostering security cooperation, not only with the United States, but with other US allies like Japan, Australia, and even South Korea. I'll just have to breeze through this. So why the return of hard balancing? Why the shift from the rhetoric of balanced foreign policy to the actual policy of hard balancing? Of course, at the onset of his term, President Marcos indicated his intention to pursue a balanced policy aimed at fostering close economic relations with China, but at the same time strengthening security relations with the United States as an insurance, as a hedge against the fact that Chinese cooperative behavior in the South China Sea would not be moderated even if the country fosters closer security cooperation with China or even effect a political rapprochement with China. China would ensure that when it comes to its territorial expansion and coercive behavior against other claimant states, it will always be business as usual. So these efforts to effect a balanced policy between China and the United States, however, were complicated by the fact that Philippine society and the armed forces of the Philippines have deep-seated suspicion of China. And of course, the key factor that pushed the Philippines back to the United States is no less than Beijing's mismanagement, Beijing's uncompromising position when it comes to the South China Sea dispute. And of course, the opportunity provided by the intensification of the US-China strategic rivalry globally, and of course, more significantly in terms of Taiwan. So this consequently pushed the Marcos administration to adopt again a policy of hard balancing towards China, requiring him to seek a dramatic improvement in Philippine-US security. Of course, closer Philippine-US security relations indicate that Manila is working more closely now, not only with Washington, but with Tokyo, Canberra, and even Seoul in advancing. In fact, the term that's currently being used right now in Philippine government agency, the Indo-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is of course a code word for concern regarding what China might do against a free and open Indo-Pacific. And of course, as indicated, as shown by President Duterte's visit to China or Beijing recently, upon the invitation of President Xi Jinping, Beijing perceives Washington gambit to unite its regional ally, along of course with the Philippines, and global ally to constrain China's expansion and balance against, of course, its growing power influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward for a very interesting and vigorous discussion later in the Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Renato De Castro, for that very comprehensive discussion of our foreign policy. So we move on now to our next speaker, who will be talking about economic resilience and President Marcos Jr.'s policies navigating global challenges. Our next speaker is a political and economic columnist at the Philippine Star and Business World. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Andrew Masigan. Good morning, sir.
Hello, Joyce. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to present my thoughts about the recently concluded SONA. I'll breeze through my thoughts about it. I don't have a presentation, but let me just narrate what I think about what my thoughts are about the SONA. So first off, credit where credit is due. No, let's highlight the major achievements of the Marcos administration during the last year. First, I would say, was the recalibration of our foreign policy. My colleague, Dr. De Castro here, recently just talked about it. It was a strategic move, which I think all in all will benefit the country in spades. No, not only will it bolster our defense capabilities, it also shows that the Philippines is not a given to China. And as far as our territorial disputes with China are concerned, I think that Marcos correctly approaches the relationship with China through a multifaceted manner. I think that is correct. And this involves diplomacy, dialogue, legal arbitration, and regional cooperation, all of which I think are on point. We give him credit for sustained business confidence, which has put the economy on the fast track of growth. And there are three reasons for this. First is political stability. Political stability on the back of his overwhelming mandate of 58.77%. The second is I would say, a generally well-considered selection of cabinet members, although there have been a lot of fallouts in the last year. And I think the most significant thing that contributed to business confidence is the absence of any action to disrupt our social and economic environment. So all in all, I don't see anything groundbreaking or any game-changing policy that Marcos has done in the last year. But just because the private sector was left alone with no disruption, the economy has gained much momentum. So let's consider that an advantage. I also think that the infrastructure program is a win. 194 projects worth $163 billion are in the pipeline. What's significant here is that only 77 are projects that are carried over from the past administration. 123 are new projects. So we can expect a sustained spending in infrastructure at the level of 5 to 6% of GDP. I also consider the increased government revenues ratio, okay, as a win. What I mean to say is our tax collections, our customs collections have increased to 16.9% of GDP. And mind you, just a decade ago, this was at 14%. So this is a big win. It goes a long way towards balancing our current account deficits. In the energy sector, 17 new power plants have been put online or have been commissioned, adding 1,174 megawatts to the grid. That is a big plus. So this will fuel the economic growth that we expect to realize in the next 5 years. Also more significantly is that finally, after 40 years, the Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao grids have been interconnected. So power capacities, surpluses can be shared with islands. Islands with surpluses can share with islands with deficits in power. Significantly, but not really taken was not really picked up by the press was the launching of 2 satellites by the DOST. And this will have profound effects or profound benefits to the country in terms of geomapping, defense, and agriculture development. Now, I'd like to highlight some inaccuracies as well in the SONA, which I think needs to be put into context. First is the assertion of the president that that his foreign trips generated 3.1 trillion pesos in foreign direct investments, and that the BOI approved 1.2 trillion worth of projects. This is highly deceiving and highly inaccurate. The real figure, okay, sorry, it's deceiving because most of these investment commitments are actually just inquiries. The real number in as far as our foreign investment intake is only 506. So what, 1/6 of what the president declared. So it was only really $9.2 billion, which was our intake last year, okay? So that was a fallacy. Another inaccuracy is that, yes, while it's true that inflation has decreased from a peak of 8.7% last June to 5.3%, sorry, 8.7% last January to 5.4% last June, it is not true that it was because of increased agricultural outputs and lowering of agricultural prices. That's not the reason why. The reason why inflation softened is because world oil prices decreased, which is an external factor. If there's anyone or any body that deserves credit for lowering inflation, it is not the agricultural sector, but the BSP for expertly manipulating interest rates and money supply. So, so that is for the inaccuracies. Now, let me speak about what I found disturbingly absent from the SONA, and that is human rights issues, particularly the case of Lilia de Lima and the investigation of the International Criminal Court on the war on drugs, or the murders or EJ case on the back of the war on drugs. Why is this significant to us? It's significant because it has bearing on our trade negotiations, particularly with the European Union. Perhaps many of you may know, or some of you may not know, that our GSP Plus, or our trade arrangements, or trade governance, our trade policies with the EU is up for negotiation this year, and contingent on this are human rights issues, particularly the ICC and Lilia de Lima. So being quiet about it puts the business sector in a dark spot. No, what's he gonna do about this situation? Where will our trade negotiations with the EU lead to? So this is a gray area. Human rights matters to us because of several reasons, not only because of the trade negotiations, but because Lilia de Lima and the victims of EJ case have rights too, and they need to be protected. We as civil society are ensured of human rights. It's enshrined in our constitution. Is this going to be sidelined now? Okay, so we need to know where the president lies, or where he stands in terms of human rights. Although we understand that he is in a conundrum. On one hand, you have the interest of civil society, of Senator de Lima, of EJK victims on one side, and on the other side, you have the interest of President Duterte and his operatives in the war on drugs, no? Plus the political threats that have been waged by this party. Will he succumb to this at the expense of human rights for the greater majority? That we'll have to see. That's still a gray area. Okay. Now, let me jump now to what I feel was the biggest gaping hole in the SONA. And this is addressing our vulnerabilities. Okay. Now, we all know that the country relies on 2 economic legs, and these are OFWs, OFW remittances, and IT BPO. Now, the reality, and I'd like to think that government is aware of this. We derive $32.5 billion from the IT BPO industry. Okay, but these are threatened. This is threatened by artificial intelligence, which is clear and present. It's already artificial intelligence is already in the mainstream. And what's at risk here is our voice-based call centers, which comprise 40% of the industry, medical and legal transcriptions, researchers, copywriters, animators, graphic designers, and many more. 1.57 million jobs, 1.5 million jobs are on the line. What's the plan? What's the plan? Okay. And I've been saying in numerous times in my columns, I've been sounding the alarm that at some point we have to climb up the value chain in IT BPO and migrate to machine-based learning, robotic process animation, nanotechnology, blockchain. These types of technology is what we need to be moving towards. And I think I suspect that there's a little bit of complacency in this administration, thinking that the 32.5 billion revenues we derive from IT BPO will last forever. Well, it will not. We have to prepare for that, okay? The second thing is about OFW remittances. We derive 36.14 billion annually from OFW remittances. The president spoke about, spoke with pride that there have been labor agreements with Saudi Arabia and Canada. Well, you know, we really have to emphasize that the deployment of foreign workers is more a sign of the weaknesses of the economy and weakness in governance rather than an achievement. That's the point we'd like to make. But even this, and this is what I want to stress, even this is a threat. Why is it a threat? Okay, the populations of developed nations are aging, and they are quickly losing their cachet or their pool of laborers. So I'm talking about countries like Japan, Denmark, Germany, England, Canada. And the thing is, the trend today is that these countries are not only offering jobs to migrant workers, notably Philippine workers, but also to their families, immigration for their families. So with the families in the host countries, will there still be a need for remittances? Maybe, but not in the same scale as when the family, the father, the children are back in the Philippines, no? So we see in our study shows that while we've been growing between 3 to 5% in our remittances, moving forward, this will revert to a decrease in foreign in OFW remittances as we move forward to 2030, 2040. How are we preparing for this? As I've been writing vehemently, we must shift to an investment-led economy rather than a consumer-led economy, so we can generate jobs. That's really the only solution. But going back to my point, my point is that we must prepare for a weakening of OFW remittances and not be complacent that it will be there forever. So that was absent in the SONA. The third thing absent with the SONA is the fact that our competitiveness rating, our economic competitiveness have been declining. So in the latest economic competitiveness report, the Philippines declined 4 places from 52nd place in 2022 to 48th place this year. And this is only from 64 nations. So we're really down there, no? We're really down in the rankings. And the culprit here is government inefficiency and business inefficiency. This has bearing to our intake of foreign direct investments, okay? And it's no surprise that our foreign direct investments, $9.2 billion last year, was the 6th of ASEAN 6. So we were the last among ASEAN 6 in terms of foreign direct investment intake. Again, competitiveness, government efficiency, business efficiency are issues that need to be addressed. And it was briefly glossed over by the president by him talking about digitization of government agencies, but he really didn't expound on how to move forward or how to accelerate digitization. He just said the customary rhetoric in that it is important and it's necessary, but really didn't give a way forward. No? So that to me was an alarming indication. Another thing left out, an important factor left out in the SONA was the worrying current account deficit, or the deficits that we incur year on year. No, our deficits in 2022 was really alarming. It was at 4.3% of GDP, amounting to 17.8 billion. That's the biggest ever in our history. But if you look at it, the current account deficit has been accelerating or widening every year. No, the culprit here is the balance of trade. So we have become a voracious importer of almost everything, from clothes to food to capital equipment to everything. No, and luxury goods, by the way, comprises 50% of or consumer and luxury goods comprises 15% of our total imports, while our exports are really lagging behind. No, so the trade deficit, or our exports minus imports, is 58 billion. So if you really look at the numbers, we export something like $76 billion, and we import something like 138 billion, in that vicinity. So you have a deficit of 58. It's a scandalous amount. No, so what does this tell us? We need to export more. We need to export more complex products. We need to diversify our economy. This is a very complicated topic to tackle, and but nonetheless important. Nonetheless important. And I was wondering why this was not even taken up in the SONA. So does the president have a plan for economic transformation? That I don't know. No. So look, there is the 8-point social economic development plan that was published, and there is the long-term socio-economic development plan, Ambition Natin, all the way up to 2040. But if you look at those plans, they're too general. They're too general to suffice. We need marching orders to our institutions and to the private sector as to how we are going to transform the economy. That is still absent. Let me talk about corruption. Okay, of course, it's customary to talk about corruption, even if its damage to the economy is unspeakable or already untenable. But let me put a number to how bad corruption is. Okay, the World Bank puts it at 20% of the national budget. Our national budget is 5.2 trillion or thereabouts. Okay, so 1 trillion pesos of the national budget is attributed to corruption. And this you can believe. This you can believe because, after all, it's become par for the course. Well, if Mayor Magalang of Baguio is to be believed, 42% of all costs of infrastructure go to kickbacks. 163 billion last year went to defective purchases or overpriced purchases. And these are by way of vaccines. These are by way of computer tablets for DepEd. These are 163 billion went to that. Okay, each congressman gets 4 to 40 billion, depending, in pork barrel. Although legally pork barrel is supposed to not exist, but the reality is that each legislator gets anywhere from 4 to 40. All these add up to a cool trillion of the people's money attributed to corruption. This was not taken up, or the transformation or the resolutions to solve corruption was not taken up in the SONA, and I found that lacking. Finally, and as I close here, I'm still unclear as to what President Marcos really wants to achieve in his presidency. it was very clear with past administrations. It was a strong republic with President GMA. It was good governance during Pinoy's time. It was a drug-free and crime-free society during Mr. Duterte's time. I'm really not clear what Mr. Marcos has wants to achieve in his administration. Unity is not an objective. Unity is not an objective. So I'm still looking for the top 3 deliverables of this administration. But all in all, yes, the last year, there have been achievements, as I have pointed out in my earlier in my talk, but many things are lacking. And so I hope to find clarity on this as we move forward. And I hope that this administration becomes clearer and more circumspect about its objectives in governance. So that's it for my sharing. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you very much for that very insightful and very interesting presentation, Mr. Andrew Masigan. Okay. Hold on. Okay. There, just had to turn on my video. Again, thank you very much for that presentation.
You're welcome.
It was a very extensive narration of wins, inaccuracies, even the disturbingly absent issues in the President's SONA. But most bothersome and noteworthy for me is still the numerical description of corruption in our country. I'm sure many of you have questions that you want to ask our speakers right now, because I know I do. And so please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box in the lower part of your screen, and we will try our best. We'll do our best to take them up later during the open forum. So we will now move on to our last speaker, who will be talking about his assessment of the economic performance of the Marcos administration during its first year in office. He is currently the president of the Minimal Government Thinkers and the columnist at the Business World. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Bienvenido Nonoy Oplas Jr. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear
Yeah.
you. You may proceed.
Okay. So I have a 12-slide PowerPoint. I can discuss this in about 10 minutes, so they can go straight to the open forum. I wrote a paper for Strat-based ADRi called An Assessment of the Economic Performance of the Marcos Jr. Administration During His First Year. So I made nine areas to assess whether it was good or bad. Okay. Introduction. In 2022, out of more than 200 countries and territories, the Philippines was the world's number 39 largest economy by GDP in nominal values, or 30th largest in GDP by purchasing power parity values. So the first assessment is the GDP growth, of course. As of June 30, 2023, I counted 101 countries that territories that reported GDP growth. Out of this 101, the Philippines has 6.4. Out of this 101, the Philippines was 10th fastest. But among the major economies, meaning the top 50 largest economies, US, Europe, etc., the Philippines 6.4% was number 1. I think many detractors failed or tried to ignore that. Parang may malang. Okay. So that was for the first quarter. For the last 3 quarters, because the second quarter is not yet available maybe next week. So I counted the second, third quarter, fourth quarter of last year, and fourth quarter this year. Okay. So out of that, G7 and East Asia and Southeast Asia, the Philippines the fastest growth of 7.1%. This is for the last 3 quarters. Next to Malaysia, 8.9, Vietnam 7.7. But the Philippines was a high growth of a high base the previous year, whereas Malaysia and Vietnam have high growth over a low base. Slide this. So I'm talking to here, this table 2. Okay, the introduction is on table 1, the Philippines ranking, and then table 2. So that Philippines have 7.1, but if you look at 7.1 versus compare on 7.6% growth the previous quarter, the previous period, versus Vietnam 7.7%, mataas, pero the base was only 1.4% growth. Malaysia 8.9% growth, but the previous period was only 1.3%. So tumaas ka sa mababa, whereas the Philippines tumaas sa mataas na. So that's what that made the Philippine growth rather impressive. And again, many detractors and haters try to ignore, if not belittle that. May malang. Okay, next. Next assessment is inflation rate. First half of January to June, and second half of July to December of each year. The Philippines 7.2% and we visited the highest inflation in ASEAN and neighbors in Asia, but not as bad as compared to UK, Italy, Germany, or Pakistan or Bangladesh. The source of inflation is not so much food and transportation, but rather alcoholic beverages and tobacco and restaurants. So if people are poor, they try to avoid partying, okay? But if people are well off, they go out, they drink more and eat more and travel more, stay in hotels more, etc. So this may be an imply an advanced spending. So this may have positive push towards faster GDP growth in the latter part of the year. Next slide. So these are the numbers that I'm talking about. No? The table 3 is comparison among many countries, including the G7. And the table 4 is the sources of inflation in the Philippines. So there is alcoholic beverages and food, restaurants and accommodation. Again, if people are poor, these are the sectors that they will avoid. But if people are relatively well off, these are the things that they will consume. Next. Assessment number 3, government borrowing rates and central bank rates. I'm referring to the 10-year government bonds. No? Multiple country, again, comparison. Well, ours as of 22 was 37%. Well, this is high, but the percentage point was modest because it was already 5% in 2020. By 2023, it's 7.7%. Only a 2 percentage point increase. Central bank rate there is high, no? From 2% in April 2022, it is now 6.25%. The reason is the shares of interest rate hikes by the central bank, mainly to control inflation, as well as to stop the depreciation of the peso when there was a massive currency depreciation in many countries around the world as the US federal rate increased. So, you know, if your dollar is invested in, say, in India or Philippines, Indonesia, and earning so much, and then you bring it back to America because of high interest rate, then a lot of dollars started flowing back to applying back to the US, and that resulted in currency depreciation in many countries. Next. Assessment number 4 is ratings upgrade. Last May 2023, this year, the Philippines earned a ratings upgrade from Fitch from negative to stable. So a BBB stable means the risk of loan default is low. The country's ability to pay its financial obligation is high. So I wrote the Fitch ratings, the second column, S&P ratings, and Moody's ratings. So with this rate, I think that it is possible that the Philippines can overtake Thailand if we do well in Fitch, because ours is a BBB, but Thailand is BBB plus, no? So kunting sundot lang, further improvement in corporate and public finance situation, and we should be able to somehow be a part of overtake Thailand. Next. Assessment number 5, merchandise exports. Andrew already discussed it. He's correct, no? The Philippines remains a small merchandise exporter in the world, but we are a medium-sized non-merchandise exporter. No? 57 billion dollars, and in the last 3 quarters versus $58 billion in the previous period. Next. Assessment number 6, foreign direct investment. There was a fast recovery of FDI in the second half of 2021 at $7.6 billion, and down to only $4 billion in the second half, of 42% change under the Marcos administration. This is the period where capital flight back to the US many countries support. So this phenomenon is not unique to the Philippines. Many other countries experienced FDI outflow the second half of last year compared to the previous year because of the interest rate hike in the US. Assessment number 7 is unemployment rate. It declined to only 4 point. I also showed there many countries, including especially the G7 and other big Eastern economies. Philippine unemployment declined to only 4.3% in May 2023, down from 7.7% in May 2021 and 6% in May 2022. So that is practically half compared to 2 years ago. Next. Assessment number 8, agriculture. It is important because the president is also the agriculture secretary. So the gross value added in AFF or agriculture, fishery and forestry in the last 3 quarters, meaning third quarter and fourth quarter 2022 and first quarter 2023, there was a growth of 1.3%. That's a modest. The quarterly growth respectively were 2.1% in the third quarter last year, minus 0.3% in fourth quarter last year, and 2.2% growth first quarter this year. The last time that AFF had a growth above 2% was in third quarter 2019 or 4 years ago. So the growth in the first quarter this year was rather good. But if you look at it, the growth of AFF for the past 10 years is something like 1 to 2%. No, it's always muted because there is high underreporting of the output from the farms, the forests, the rivers, lakes, the sea, etc. Next. Last assessment is people mobility in terms of sale of passenger cars. There's consumer confidence, people going out, spending more. As I said, it was reflected in inflation. The resort in La Union, in Bicol, etc., are having a good day because people are spending more, and people they have cars to travel. They don't have to rely on buses, or renting vehicles. Okay, so the fast growth in sales of vehicles. Under the current administration, a 9.4% growth in the second half of 2022, and 30% growth in first half of 2023. Summary: out of the 9 areas that have been assessed, the administration performance could be characterized to follow. Good in 4 areas: 1, GDP growth; 2, ratings upgrade; 3, low unemployment; and 4, people mobility. So good job, yeah, modest or mild performance, meaning not bad, but not too good either. Interest rate, meaning government rate and the policy rate, the merchandise export, in FDI and in agriculture. Next. Admittedly, the Philippines, the administration has poor performance in controlling high inflation. But again, the areas where commodity inflation is high also point to high consumer spending of less necessities, like alcohol, beverage, and tobacco, and accommodation hotels. Please point out that high consumer confidence may just prod other sectors to expand production. So to summarize, one sentence: the first year of Marcos administration is off to a good start, creating more jobs and opportunities for Filipinos and foreigners doing business here. So that's the paper. I also wrote a 4-part column in Business World. Part 1 is budget deficit and unemployment, last July 4. Part 2 is inflation interest rate, last July 11. Part 3 was trade and investment, and Part 4 was GDP growth and agriculture. Last time. Next. Okay, this is my last slide. This is my column last Tuesday. Yesterday. SONA 2023, there are many sectors covered, but I focus only on 3: investment, revenues, and climate. I want to focus in this slide because the trend of FDI on the left are the 4 biggest economies of Europe: France, Germany, Italy, and UK. And on the right are the big among the big East ASEAN economies, from top to bottom: Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. On the left, they have flatlining, it's not mild deceleration. Kumbaga, they were stuck, okay? Stuck on you for the last 15 years. Whereas for the ASEAN 4, there's a rising trend. So Europe's slow path to deindustrialization, the growth economic because of the climate, energy, ESG policies. No, so we want the Philippines to take the path of the industrialization, the growth of blackout economics using the more climate friendly policies. So the Philippine economic team should attract companies from Europe because many of them are already migrating to North America and Asia, particularly Vietnam. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Nonoy Oplas, for that very informative presentation, sir. So at this point, we will now proceed to the open forum. And again, to those who wish to participate in the open forum, you may write your questions in the Q&A box below. Now, to provide a synthesis of the presentations and also to moderate the discussion, may we call on the policy and the regulatory manager of Strat-based ADR Institute and a co-convener of Democracy Watch Philippines, Ms. Mashan Bernice Shanice Espiritu.
Hello, everyone. Good morning to our speakers and good morning to our guests who are joining us on Zoom today. So before we move on to the open forum, let me provide an analysis or essentially a synthesis of what has been discussed today. So first, we have our first speaker, Dr. Holmes, and he discussed the latest Pulse Asia survey results. And what we learned from this is how graft and corruption are a constant national concern with the Filipino public. And President BBM is more focused towards corruption's corrosive influence rather than addressing the root causes of corruption. And so one of his recommendations, and this is something that I agree as well, is that we need to create an independent anti-corruption institution that is isolated from political influences. Now we move on to the next speaker, Dr. De Castro, where he discussed the return of the Bongbong Marcos administration back to hard balancing by working towards stronger U.S. relations. So this is in the area of foreign policy. We have key events that he's discussed, such as the continuation of the AFP modernization program. We have the EDCA as well. And in this, all of these different events, and also with his statements, we see an explicit shift in the administration's foreign policy moving into the second year forward. We also have Mr. Masigan, who narrated his assessment. He gave us a very comprehensive, he gave us an overview of different areas discussed in the SONA and not discussed in the SONA. We've seen him discuss what the president has done well. For instance, we've seen also inaccuracies mentioned by the president. At the same time, Mr. Masigan also discussed the lack of discussion in certain issues such as human rights, which are really essential to investments and trade coming from other countries such as the EU. And we also see special attention, the lack of special attention to certain vulnerabilities, which could lead to an economic downturn such as the IT BPO industry and AI coming into place. And at the same time, the potential decline of OFW remittances. Lastly, Mr. Oplas gave us an economic assessment of the Philippines, the gains that we've seen, and at the same time, vis-a-vis other countries in terms of, for instance, credit ratings. We have unemployment rates, how there are low unemployment rates in the current administration, foreign direct investments. We also have the lack of essentially inflation not being the policies not being effective towards curbing high inflation, and so on. So what we've seen throughout all these discussions is that there are moderate wins across the economy, while specific areas in different sectors also need more attention as well. Now, what I want to emphasize in this synthesis is that the issue of corruption, because we're also talking about the Pulse Asia survey, is a cross-cutting one since it affects business confidence. It has been discussed by many of our speakers, but beyond that, we have the public trust and the ability of people to support government initiatives is affected as a result of this. So now, in moving into our open forum, may I again call on our speakers, Mr. Nonoy Oplas, Dr. Ronnie Holmes, Dr. Renato De Castro, and Mr. Andrew Masigan to open their cameras, and you will be spotlighted. All right. Thank you again, gentlemen, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have all of you and your really very key assessments of what's happened in the SONA. I have a general question to start off the discussion, and then later we'll be discussing other questions coming from the members of the public as well. So one general discussion, if you could give us, in a way, in a nutshell, what is the most noteworthy difference between this SONA, the State of the Nation address, and President Marcos Jr.'s first State of the Nation address? And one thing just to bring this discussion deeper, a little deeper, is I want to ask, how was this difference shaped by his 1 year in office? So this can be a general assessment of how different it was, or this can be in your specific areas or specific fields.
I'll answer it first, huh?
Yes, sir.
I just want to focus on two things that were mentioned in SONA 2023 and not mentioned in SONA 2022. One, is Maharlika Fund, and the other, the MUP pension reform. The MUP pension reform is a very, I would say, it's a corrupt system. The pensioners, they receive 160 to 200 billion pesos a year, and they contribute zero. Okay, the government doctors, the government nurse, government agents, they pay through the GSIS. This MUP, they don't pay even a single centavo. And then when they get their pension, it's tax free. So they're receiving 100,000 a month, 150,000 pesos a month, tax free. Whereas the pension that they get from GSIS is a tax, right? It's very important that the president, especially the economic team, is singled out on this MUP pension reform because it's a highly anomalous and pambutas sa taxpayers. Second is the Maharlika Investment Fund. It is highly criticized, but I believe that we need this fund. We need the fund because a lot of the important infrastructure projects are killed by politics. Look at Bataan nuclear plant, it's killed by politics. Look at the Tampakan mining, $5.10 billion, the single biggest FDI in this country has ever experienced, was killed by politics, by the provincial government. So if you have an investment fund with a government signature on it, I think that whatever terrorism and harassment by the other officials can be balanced. And second, many big sovereign wealth funds are abroad, might be interested to come out the way of counterpart putting their money there. We might as well put our money there. So it's sort of a magnet to other sovereign wealth funds. So I think that's important that the two things, the MUP pension report and the Maharlika investment, was put in SONA 2023.
Thank you, Mr. Oplas. Anyone else from our panel wants to go next? Maybe can I call on Dr. De Castro maybe to give us something from your field that is a difference from the first and the second SONA?
But historically, foreign policy is not given that much importance. When you talk about the State of the Nation address, generally presidents would focus on the economics, their economic accomplishments. If it's something to do with international relations, it's more of international economic policy. Not so much when it comes to security, not so much when it comes to classic geopolitics. Of course, last year was kind of dramatic when he mentioned that he would not surrender a square inch of Philippine territory. Then, of course, he talks about his goal of finding the balance in terms of dealing with China and, of course, dealing with the United States. Of course, the last SONA was very short when it comes to foreign policy, and I attribute it to two factors. Number one, he would like to emphasize more on the accomplishments, which are primarily economic. And number two, of course, as we've seen in the last year, foreign policy, security policy, of course, has become very divisive, especially, of course, when he made the decision, when he decided, of course, to make that shift away from China. And of course, you have a lot of sectors who benefit, or individuals who benefit from that appeasement policy within the Duterte administration. Of course, even within its own family. I need not to mention who has been criticizing the decision to ship to EDCA, and of course basically stated that we have to deal with the presence of Chinese vessels in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, and the presence of American planes here in Clark or in the Ninoy Aquino International Airport as equal. So I think that's the reason why he did not mention a lot about foreign policy in the second SONA, although he mentioned something that is very short, but of course very substantive, when he basically said, the Philippines is part of the rules-based international order. So in a way, he's basically assuring those countries that have, countries where, of course, he aligned our foreign policy, our defense policy, but at the same time, it's also telling China on where we stand. Of course, this will be very challenging this coming year, given or taking into account the the visit of the former president to Beijing just a few days before the SONA. So I stop here.
Thank you, Dr. De Castro. Mr. Masigan, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. I'll answer it in two ways. Difference of last year's SONA to this year's SONA. Let's talk about it in terms of form and substance. In form, clearly the president has come to himself or has gained a lot of confidence in being the chief executive of the nation. I thought he was very statesmanlike. I thought he was very eloquent, and I thought he also exuded confidence in being the leader of the country. His choice of words were really eloquent. I give him 10 out of 10 in terms of form, and nothing. Maybe the bar is so low, but nothing he did or said was a cause for embarrassment for the nation. So I consider that a plus. In terms of substance, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think the president, and in the economic realm, let's talk about the economic realm. I don't think the president really has a clear agenda yet on what he wants to do. It wasn't apparent last year, neither is it apparent this year. What I'm hearing is that it's all about amassing investments, which is the reason for his foreign trips in the first place. Nothing wrong with that. That's very good, but it has to be strategic. At some point, we have to make a shift in our economic paradigm, a shift in our economic model, transforming the company to a simplistic one where we export. By the way, here's the real number. We export only 1,040 products, as compared to more than 3,000 products exported by Thailand. So we need to transform the economy to one that is more complex. Okay. And there are many, many discussions towards that objective. I don't think he's there yet. Okay. I'm hoping that at some point within this year, it will become more clear to him what a sound economic agenda will be and how to lead the economy towards being a high income one within the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you. And lastly, Dr. Holmes, maybe you have some reflections regarding the differences between his first and his second SONA.
I did watch both first and second, but I read the SONAs. I mean, as a political scientist, we're bound to read it. But essentially, it's a list of what he thinks they've achieved. But to me, it lacks really emphasis on the needed reforms that would really more or less ease business transactions. Because, many of the business transactions, as Nonoy pointed out, there's a lot of politics, and I'm not referring to pressures coming from other groups. I'm referring to pressures coming from groups that are already powerful to begin with. Political reform is not in the agenda in either the two SONAs. Corruption is not in any way mentioned. Of course, it's not something that you expect from Bongbong Marcos. But as president, he could have touched on it. He touched on it only with regard to digitization or digitalization. But as I said, that's it. So it's not too different from the SONAs we've heard before. A list of accomplishment, a laundry list of things to do, but they're also broad. And I think the direction is really quite vague and unclear. It's like, let's do everything. This is what we've done. and there's no clarity in terms of what really is the vision, what is the strategy to get us to that vision in 2040.
May I interject?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think Dr. Holmes hit the nail on the head. What is the vision until 2028? What does he want to achieve? I think that's what we're all asking for. In the socio-economic realm, where are we heading? No, so I know that we have the medium-term socio-economic plan to rely on, but we've got to hear it from him, because based on his utterances, the bureaucracy and the private sector fall in line. So we need the marching orders. We really don't know where he wants to take the country. I think that's the core of the matter.
Mm-hmm. Yes. There was also an interesting question that was asked regarding this question on the ambiguity that comes with his programs and reforms. But let me first go to one question asked by AC Nichols from CNN Philippines. So she said, "Good morning. This is AC Nichols from CNN Philippines. The need to create an anti-corruption institution free from political influences mentioned." So I think that this question can be directed to Dr. Holmes. What about the Office of the Ombudsman? Would you say the office is ineffective in terms of carrying out its mandate? And a second question is, what contributes to this attitude of Filipinos that corruption is normal? Can we blame this on failed attempts to go after erring officials? An example would be PDAF scam cases, the PCSO plunder case versus former President GMA.
I'll answer them quickly. The
Yeah.
second one, yes, you can blame it on previous attempts towards prosecuting but failing to convict officials.
Mhm.
And the first one, would you say that the ombudsman is ineffective? Yes, my short answer is yes. If you remember, this is the same ombudsman that in the previous administration said that people should not even ask for the SALN of officials. How can the one in charge of fighting corruption prevent the public from gaining information as regards the wealth, the assets and liabilities or net worth of public officials? Coming from the ombudsman, that to me is really a surrender on his part in terms of his primary mandate. Now, that's an aside. No? I mean, the other thing is that we know that the ombudsman is really not well-resourced. The number of personnel in the office is quite limited. And then you have other agencies, although Bongbong Marcos has not appointed the one to be in charge of the Presidential Anti-Graft Commission. There's a multiplicity of agencies going against corruption. They're working at cross purposes. I think there's a need really to come up with a single agency that's well-resourced and independent.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. So to the question a while ago regarding ambiguity, let me just go back to that to allow for the other panelists to also give their thoughts about it. So one of the questions asked as well is, and I maybe we'd like Dr. De Castro to speak about this, no? And then Dr. and Mr. Oplas. One of the things that was asked is, some political commentators have described President Marcos Jr.'s administration as playing it safe. So now both of you are in different areas. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement?
Well, of course, I agree. His foreign policy, the statement of friends to all, enemy to none, we know for a fact that could not be achieved. Given the fact that we are caught in the middle of a great power competition. So for one thing, how can you be a friend to a country, a great power, that is, of course, trying to deprive you of your maritime entitlement? That is, of course, preparing for a major conflict against the closest country to the Philippines. And of course, we have your security alliance with the United States. So how can you basically consider yourself a friend to all, enemy to none? So the safest way is to come out with this very general rhetoric that not even, of course, Jesus Christ was able to achieve in the New Testament. Now, Jesus Christ had enemies then. But how can a nation state that is, of course, tasked and, of course, oriented towards advancing its national interest against the interests of other countries achieve that goal of becoming friends to all, enemies to none? So the safest way is to rely on a very general and to a certain degree simplistic rhetoric. So I'll keep it at that. Now, it's a goal that, of course, no human beings, no nation states could achieve, but it's still using that rhetoric as the mantra of Philippine foreign policy: friends to all, enemies to none.
Thank you, Dr. De Castro. Mr. Oplas, do you have thoughts about this in terms of maybe economic policy of the administration?
Yeah, I think that I would like to disagree with the previous assessment that there is ambiguity in terms of vision. I think it's very clear, no? By 2028, the debt GDP ratio should go back to 3% versus about 6%. That's very clear. It's not ambiguous. Yeah, debt and then now deficit over GDP ratio is from 6% down to 3%. That's very specific. It's very clear, explicit. And then the public debt over GDP ratio should decline from 61% down to about 38%, something like that. So again, it's very explicit. There's no ambiguity there. Okay. With regards to I think on the foreign policy, I think that it is really good to play itself, because the main reason why the world is so much into many wars is because there's too much intervention. US nasa Africa, nasa Afghanistan, nasa Iraq, nasa Syria, nasa Ukraine, gusto ba sa Taiwan. You know, the Philippines, Malaysia conflict in Sabah, may gera na if US and UK are involved. But because US and UK are not involved, you know, there's a continuing claims over Sabah, but there's no shooting. Okay, why? Because wala nakakialam. At I think that the point is that on the Taiwan issue, hanggat tayo maaari, wag tayo makialam dyan. Okay, so that's it. I think that playing safe, in particular in foreign policy, is a good policy. It was good. It was bad during the Duterte administration, because it was too explicitly pro China, and yeah, and I think that mag-usap lang kayo, mag-usap. Huwag na masyadong makialam.
Thank you, Mr. Oplas. Dr. De Castro, you have some thoughts?
Well, I have to remind Mr. Oplas that the United States is not anymore in Afghanistan and Iraq. Just for your information, it decided to withdraw. Well, of course, it intervenes because it's a global power. It has the capability to do so. And of course, in the case of China, China is also actively intervening in our affairs. So that's, of course, the prerogative of great powers. So that's a reality we have to accept. And you know, the only solution there is you balance one great power to another. We cannot simply tell them not to intervene, because if they have the capability and interest to do so. The world, of course, is not fair. You're in economics, you know for a fact that even in the market, it's not fair. So I think I stop at this point.
Dr. Holmes, would you like to add a few reflections on this?
No, I agree with Nonoy. There are quantitative targets, but to me, those do not in any way pertain to a vision. A vision is something that is much broader. It is, you know, I remember during the Ramos administration, the strategies towards reforming the economy were quite clear, but it ended up short of really addressing social reforms. You know, so there's a combination of political, social, and economic reforms, and maybe the economic reforms and economic targets are clear, but on the social and political front, these are things that we miss, that are not in any way articulated in the State of the Nation address.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. One thing that we've been seeing throughout this discussion is that, as mentioned by a lot of the speakers, the president has really focused his efforts on seeing, you know, economic reforms come to fruition, and among other things. But some of the issues remain largely unaddressed. And what's interesting about this discussion is that it brings together economic reforms don't live in a vacuum, and we also have social reforms that need to come together. And part of that is a discussion on essentially how corruption can affect the current political and economic situation. And that's why these two issues are quite entangled in our discussion here today. So we have a lot of really interesting discussions coming from our panelists. So maybe I'll coming from the public, and let me just get one question each from the public to give to our speakers. So for this one, for Mr. Masigan, so one person asked, President Marcos Jr. stated in his State of the Nation address that the economic agenda cannot and will not ever be incompatible with our climate change agenda. So he emphasized the importance of the green and blue economies. What do you make of such an approach to climate change, one that integrates economic and environmental considerations?
I think it's essential and a part and parcel of the entire equation. Not to mention that we have commitments in terms of carbon. What do you call this? Our carbon quotient. No, we have commitments to make from 2030 and 2050. It goes part and parcel, and I have to say I'm quite happy that the Department of Energy has really taken these commitments to heart. By law, we have to have a ratio of 30% renewable energy in our power mix by the year 2030 and 50% in our power mix by the year 2050. And we're well on our way to achieving that. So coupled with the Clean Air Act and the Renewable Energy Act, I think we're in a good place in as far as climate change is concerned.
All right, thank you, Mr. Masigan. So my next question, and these are our last few questions coming from the public, is to Mr. Oplas. So in his first SONA address, President Marcos Jr. outlined an 8-point economic agenda. And one of the points was his commitment to reducing barriers to entry and limits to entrepreneurship. To what extent has the administration succeeded at this?
In entrepreneurship?
Limits, reducing barriers. So one of his points was his commitment to reducing barriers to entry. So one example was given is the ASEAN RCEP. So would this be an example of success for the President Marcos?
Yes, I think so. I think that he started with a big investment. Like for instance, from September 2022 until last week, there were about 8 Philippine economic briefings or PEB abroad. No, Jakarta, Singapore, New York, Washington DC, Frankfurt, London, Tokyo, and Toronto. And I think that he quantified the amount of investment pledges, something like 3.2 billion pesos, from $1 billion to 3 billion pesos equivalent. So it's something like that, no? Then he created green lanes in some big ticket items. I think what he forgot is not down the level, because from what I heard, entrepreneur friends, the problem is really in the LGUs, no? Masyadong maraming bureaucracy, Bureau of Fire Protection. I mean, hindi ka can get your business permit unless you buy the fire extinguisher from the cronies. Okay, so those are low to medium level corruption by the agencies, by the bureaucracy. And I think that I am not sure what have been done about it. Maybe ARTA is doing something about it. No, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. The second to the last question is for Dr. De Castro. So President Marcos stated that he intends to issue a proclamation granting amnesty to rebel returnees. So this is part of the current administration's pivot away from internal security towards external defense. How does this reconfiguration of DND and AFP priorities affect the way the nation deals with the West Philippine Sea issue?
Well, of course, you really need to shift away from internal to external security. And this will of course have a 3 implication in terms of how the AFP views itself. Number one, of course, it's a totally different ball game when you shift from internal to external. This will involve in terms of the force structure of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. You will have to move away from an army-centric armed forces to one that is, of course, tri-service, where you give, of course, priority to your Air Force and, of course, your Navy. And those 2 armed services were, of course, neglected because a huge part of the budget has also been allocated to the Army. This will also make an impact in terms of your defense budget. When you're focused on internal security, you just pay for your salary of your soldiers. You just provide them light weapons. It's a totally different picture when you will have to acquire big ticket items like frigates, like multi-purpose fighter planes. You talk in terms of surface-to-air missiles, and so forth and so on, radar. So this will also affect, in fact, your economy. A large part of your economy, your resources, would have to be, you have to increase your defense budget. So this creates what economists would call the guns versus butter dilemma. And this has always been the problem in terms of, shifting the armed forces of the Philippines away from internal security to, of course, external defense or the modernization program of the armed forces of the Philippines. More importantly, this will also affect in terms of the mind frame, the attitude of the armed forces. The armed forces mind frame is that of a dignified constabulary. The armed forces of the Philippines has been focused on internal security ever since, of course, we became an independent state. When the armed forces Philippine Army was, of course, directed against the Hukbalahap. Now it's a totally different picture if you have to direct them against, of course, the armed forces of other countries. That's why the president always emphasized it begins with the mindset. It begins with, of course, the AFP getting to know new technologies, and more significantly also in terms of the focus away from simply acting like a dignified constabulary to an armed forces that, of course, will have to defend our maritime borders.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. De Castro. And our last question goes to Dr. Holmes. So with your discussion of the president's focus on corrosive influence and not really addressing the root causes of corruption in its structure, what is a possible result of the administration's deprioritization of controlling corruption in the following years?
Well, we'll have more of the same, and that's a problem for all of us. So unless there's attention given to the causes of corruption, which includes the weakness of the anti-corruption agency, a review of the compensation, the insulation of the bureaucracy from politics, essentially, I wonder how many more undersecretaries there would be in many of the departments. And sometimes I shiver when I see that the undersecretaries or the secretaries are people who are not necessarily familiar about the work that they're supposed to do. In this case, that also influences, because that's type of political corruption when appointments are based on your political affiliation rather than on merit. That will weaken the bureaucracy. So there are many things that can be done. I'm not saying that this is a problem only of this administration, but there is no indication as to what this administration would do. And that would really lead to just escalation of this problem rather than a control of the levels of corruption.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. Holmes, and thank you to all our speakers for answering the questions that have been brought about by the public. Now, we have a lot more questions. There are a lot of people interested in different areas that we've discussed today, but unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through them. I suggest for the public who have more questions to get in touch with our speakers. I'm sure that they would be very keen to answer your questions about their fields as well and what we've discussed today. So now, as I give again my closing remarks, thank you to everyone, to Dr. Ronnie Holmes, we have Dr. Renata De Castro, we have Mr. Andrew Masigan, and Mr. Nonoy Oplas. Thank you as well to the team of StratBase ADRi for making this event possible, and for the rest of our viewers as well on Facebook Live and here on Zoom who have joined and listened to our panelists' discussions. Now, the Marcos Jr. administration is, as we know, an administration that is heavily watched and scrutinized for few reasons. First is, of course, we've seen the polarity of politics brought about by the election of the president. Second is we are at the center of the increasing geopolitical tension in the South China Sea and, of course, in the West Philippine Sea. And the Philippines is at the heart of that conflict. Third is, of course, we have the economic trends brought about by the COVID-19 disruptions to the global economy that affects our own country as well. And last, we also have the difference between the past administrations and the current one in terms of its policy directions in curbing corruption. We see that all of these things are quite relevant, to which is why we continue to watch this administration closely. Now, our speakers have provided a very comprehensive assessment of the administration's second State of the Nation address, and at the same time, the results of the Pulse Asia and corruption survey. And this gives us an indication of the policy direction for the next 5 years or so. So whether it be in terms of economic policy, whether this be in terms of social issues like corruption, or in foreign policy, we continue to stay vigilant as people because we are the beneficiaries of what is going to be discussed in the next few years and what policy reforms will come out of this administration. So I hope that all of you have gained something today. I certainly have, and I look forward to seeing the rest of you all. And for our speakers, thank you once again for your time and for your dedication to discussing these issues. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, and that wraps up our forum for today. It's been a very insightful morning. Again, thank you very much to our speakers, Professor Dindo Manhit, Mr. Bienvenido Oplas, Dr. Ronald Holmes, Dr. Renato De Castro, Mr. Andrew Masigan, and our moderator, Ms. Shanice Espiritu. And thank you very much as well to all of our online participants who joined us this morning. We hope to see you again in our next forum, and have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.